The Madison Grill sat on the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Manhattan that cost more per square foot than most people's apartments. It was exactly noon on a Tuesday in March when Marcus Chen walked through the heavy glass doors, his $1,000 shoes clicking against Italian marble that had been imported specifically for this restaurant's floors. He was early, which was strategic, because being early meant you controlled the table, controlled the atmosphere, controlled the first impression. Marcus had built Chen Digital Solutions from a two-person startup in his apartment to a $100 million enterprise in 7 years, and he'd done it by controlling every variable he possibly could. Today's lunch meeting was the biggest variable of his career. Sitting across from him in exactly 12 minutes would be Gerald Whitmore, the CEO of Pinnacle Industries, a manufacturing conglomerate worth $3 billion. Pinnacle was old money, old methods, old everything, but they needed to modernize their entire digital infrastructure, or risk becoming irrelevant in a market that was leaving them behind. Marcus had the solution. He had the pitch. He had the 47-slide presentation loaded on his tablet. What he didn't have was certainty, because Whitmore was known in business circles as the man who'd walked out of more meetings than he'd stayed in, the executive who'd once told a Forbes journalist that he could smell desperation from across a conference table. The restaurant buzzed with the quiet intensity of power lunches happening at every table. Lawyers negotiated deals over seared tuna. Investment bankers discussed mergers between bites of Wagyu beef. A tech founder tried to convince venture capitalists that his app was the next unicorn, and weaving between all of them, carrying plates and refilling water glasses, and somehow managing to be invisible and essential at the same time, was Sarah Mitchell. She'd been working at the Madison Grill for 8 months, ever since her graphic design agency had collapsed, and taken her savings with it. The restaurant job was supposed to be temporary, just until she figured out her next move, but temporary had a way of becoming permanent when you were 34 and starting over. She'd learned the rhythm of the place quickly, learned which tables needed constant attention and which ones wanted to be left alone, learned that the real power in these rooms wasn't always sitting in the chair you'd expect. Marcus checked his watch for the 3rd time in 2 minutes. His palms were sweating, which annoyed him because he'd trained himself not to show nervousness. He'd rehearsed this pitch 17 times. He knew every word, every transition, every response to every possible objection, but Whitmore wasn't a normal client, and this wasn't a normal deal. If he landed Pinnacle Industries, Chen Digital Solutions would triple in size overnight. If he failed, his competitors would know he'd tried and failed, and in Silicon Valley failed attempts at major deals had a way of becoming cautionary tales. Gerald Whitmore arrived at exactly 12:12, which meant he was 2 minutes late, which meant he was exactly on time by the standards of men who believed that making people wait was its own form of communication. He was 68 years old, silver-haired in that way that made people use words like distinguished and commanding, and he carried himself with the absolute certainty of someone who'd been proven right more often than wrong for 5 decades. His assistant had briefed him on Marcus Chen during the car ride over. Young, brilliant, cocky in that way Silicon Valley types always were, building his company on venture capital money and promises of disruption. Whitmore had seen 100 Marcus Chens in his career, all of them convinced they were going to change the world, most of them gone within 5 years. But Pinnacle Industries needed something, needed it badly, and Chen Digital Solutions had the reputation for delivering results even if their founder had the personality of every tech bro Whitmore had ever tolerated at conferences. Marcus stood as Whitmore approached, extending his hand with a smile that was meant to project confidence, but came across slightly too eager. They shook and Marcus gestured to the booth he'd selected, the one with the best view and the most privacy from neighboring tables. Sarah appeared beside them as they sat down, her presence so smooth it was almost like she'd materialized from the air itself. She set down 2 water glasses, offered menus, rattled off the specials in a voice that was professional and warm without being intrusive. Whitmore ordered a scotch, neat. Marcus ordered sparkling water, wanting to keep his head completely clear. Sarah nodded and disappeared. The opening minutes of the conversation were standard corporate theater. Marcus asked about Whitmore's flight from Chicago. Whitmore mentioned the weather had been terrible. They discussed the restaurant, the view, the general state of the Manhattan business scene. It was all prelude, all ritual, the conversational equivalent of two fighters circling each other before the bell rang. Then Marcus opened his tablet and started his pitch. He talked about cloud infrastructure and data analytics and artificial intelligence integration. He showed charts demonstrating how Chen Digital Solutions had reduced operating costs for their previous clients by an average of 37%. He explained his 5-phase implementation plan, each phase designed to minimize disruption while maximizing efficiency gains. He was good at this, had been practicing this exact presentation for weeks, and he could see Whitmore listening, processing, considering. But he could also see something else in the older man's expression, something that made his stomach tighten. It was the look of someone who was hearing exactly what they expected to hear, nothing more, nothing less. Sarah returned with their drinks, and as she set down Whitmore's scotch, the older man asked her a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "How long have you worked here?" Whitmore asked, his eyes leaving Marcus's tablet for the first time since the pitch had started. Sarah paused just for a second, caught off guard by being directly addressed. 8 months, sir, she said. Whitmore nodded slowly, took a sip of his scotch and then turned back to Marcus. "Continue," he said, but something in the room had shifted. Some invisible current had changed direction, and Marcus felt it even though he couldn't name it. Marcus pushed through the rest of his presentation with the methodical precision he'd practiced, but he could feel it slipping away from him. Whitmore was still listening, still asking occasional questions, but there was something perfunctory about it now, like a teacher letting a student finish an oral report even though the grade had already been decided. The numbers were solid, the case studies were impressive, the implementation timeline was realistic. Everything Marcus was saying was objectively correct and professionally delivered, but it wasn't connecting, wasn't landing with the impact he needed. This was the problem with pitching to people like Whitmore, people who'd been in business longer than Marcus had been alive. They'd heard every pitch, seen every presentation, learned to spot the difference between genuine innovation and well-packaged iteration. And right now, Chen Digital Solutions was looking more like the latter than the former. Sarah brought their food, setting down plates of pan-seared salmon and roasted vegetables with the kind of precision timing that came from months of watching tables and knowing exactly when to interrupt and when to hold back. She'd seen dozens of these business lunches play out, had learned to read the body language and gauge whether a deal was going well or poorly. This one was definitely trending toward poorly. The young guy, Marcus, was trying too hard, pushing too eagerly. The older man was pulling back, creating distance. It was a dance she'd watched before, and it almost always ended the same way. Marcus took a bite of his salmon without tasting it, trying to figure out what was going wrong and how to fix it. He'd prepared for objections about cost, about implementation timeline, about integration challenges with Pinnacle's existing systems. What he hadn't prepared for was this kind of polite disengagement, this sense that Whitmore was already mentally composing the rejection email his assistant would send tomorrow. "You're very good at what you do," Whitmore said, which was exactly the kind of compliment that came before "Your company has an impressive track record. These numbers are compelling." He paused, took another sip of his scotch, looked out at the Manhattan skyline, stretched beyond the window. "But I've seen this before. Different company, different faces, same promise. Cut costs, increase efficiency, digital transformation. It's all true. And it's all meaningless if the people implementing it don't understand what they're actually transforming." Marcus felt his carefully constructed pitch crumbling. "With respect, Miss Whitmore, we've successfully implemented these systems for 17 companies in the last 3 years. Our retention rate is 94%. The results speak for themselves." Whitmore nodded, but it was the kind of nod that meant he was being polite, not that he was being convinced. "Results matter. But Pinnacle isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. We're a 93-year-old company built by people who worked with their hands. My grandfather started that business in a garage in Detroit. We make things, physical things, and the people who work for us take pride in them. I'm not interested in hiring someone who sees our company as just another client to add to their portfolio." It was the death blow, delivered calmly and without malice, and Marcus knew it. He'd lost the deal. Lost it somewhere in the last 15 minutes without even realizing where the fatal mistake had been made. He started to respond, to try to salvage something, but Whitmore's attention had already shifted, his eyes tracking something across the restaurant. Sarah was approaching their table again, water pitcher in hand, and Whitmore watched her with that same calculating expression he'd had earlier. Whitmore did something then that caught both Marcus and Sarah off guard. He stopped her as she reached for his water glass, holding up one hand in a gesture that was polite but firm. "I have a question for you," he said, looking directly at Sarah with an intensity that made her instinctively take half a step back. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, unsure if she'd somehow made a mistake, if there was something wrong with the service or the food or something else she couldn't identify. Whitmore gestured between himself and Marcus. "We're discussing a potential business deal. This young man wants to digitally transform my company, wants to bring us into the modern age with artificial intelligence and cloud computing and all the rest of it. You've been listening to this conversation, I'm sure, even if you weren't trying to. You seem like you pay attention to things." Sarah glanced at Marcus, who looked as confused as she felt. "I'm just trying to do my job, sir," she said carefully. "I know," Whitmore said, "and you're doing it well, but humor me for a moment. You work here, you've worked other jobs, I assume. You interact with systems and processes every day. When companies try to modernize, try to implement new technology, what's the one thing they always get wrong?" The question hung in the air like something physical. Marcus was staring at Whitmore now, trying to figure out what game the older man was playing, whether this was some kind of test or power move or something else entirely. Sarah could feel the eyes of nearby tables turning toward them, drawn by the unusual nature of a CEO asking a waitress for business advice during a power lunch. She had two choices. She could deflect, could say something polite and non-committal, and get back to her job, or she could answer honestly, could say what she actually thought, what she'd learned from 8 months of watching corporate deals happen across these tables, what she'd learned from watching her own design agency fail, because they'd made exactly the mistakes everyone made. "They forget that systems serve people, not the other way around," Sarah said, the words coming out before she'd fully decided to speak them. "Every company I've ever worked for, every client my agency used to have, they'd get so excited about the new technology, the new software, the new process, and they'd spend millions of dollars implementing it. And then they'd spend maybe a few hours training the people who actually had to use it, and then they'd act surprised when nobody used it correctly, or when productivity dropped instead of improved, or when everyone just found workarounds to avoid the new system entirely. They optimized the technology without optimizing for the human beings who had to live with it every single day." The table went quiet. Marcus looked like he'd been slapped. Whitmore was completely still, his scotch glass halfway to his lips, frozen in a moment of absolute attention. Sarah suddenly realized she'd just criticized a potential multi-million-dollar deal in front of the two people most invested in making it happen, and she could feel her job slipping away from her with every word she'd spoken. But then Whitmore did something unexpected. He smiled, not the polite corporate smile he'd been wearing all lunch, but something genuine and surprised, like he'd just found something valuable that he hadn't known he was looking for. Whitmore set down his glass and turned his full attention to Sarah in a way that made her feel simultaneously exposed and oddly respected. "Tell me more," he said, and it wasn't a request, it was a command from someone who'd just heard something that changed the entire equation of his day. Sarah wanted to apologize, to backtrack, to say she'd overstepped and didn't know what she was talking about, but there was something in Whitmore's expression that told her he actually wanted the truth, wanted the perspective he'd been missing from every other polished pitch he'd sat through. "I used to run a graphic design agency," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice was. "Small company, just me and 3 other people. We did good work, we had good clients, and then about 2 years ago we decided to modernize everything. New project management software, new billing system, new client portal, all cloud-based, all supposedly going to make everything easier. We spent $40,000 we didn't really have on implementation and training, and you know what happened? Everything got slower. Every task that used to take 5 minutes now took 20 because you had to log into 3 different systems and fill out 5 different forms. My designers spent more time updating project status fields than actually designing. Our clients got frustrated because the new portal was confusing and they just wanted to email us directly like they always had. Within 6 months we'd lost 3 major clients. My team was burned out, and we were hemorrhaging money trying to maintain systems that were supposed to save us money. Marcus was gripping his water glass so tightly his knuckles had gone white. This was his pitch being systematically dismantled by a waitress who had no business being part of this conversation, and yet he couldn't interrupt because Whitmore was hanging on every word. So what happened? Whitmore asked. We went bankrupt, Sarah said flatly, not because the technology was bad, but because we implemented it like every other company implements it. We focused on what the software could do instead of what we actually needed it to do. We didn't involve our team in the decision-making process, didn't adjust our workflows to match how people actually worked, didn't build in flexibility for the fact that every client and every project was different. We treated modernization like it was just a matter of buying the right tools instead of fundamentally rethinking how we operated, and when it failed we blamed the software, blamed the implementation company, blamed everything except the fact that we'd approached the entire thing back. Whitmore leaned back in his seat, and for the first time since sitting down, he looked genuinely engaged with the conversation happening at this table. And if you had to do it again, he said, if you had to modernize a company, how would you approach it different? Sarah glanced at Marcus again, saw something in his expression that was shifting from anger to something else, something more complicated. She'd already gone this far, had already probably lost her job, might as well finish the thought. I'd start with the people who actually do the work, she said. Not management, not IT, but the people on the floor, the people in the trenches who touch the process every single day. I'd ask them what's broken, what's frustrating, what wastes their time, and then I'd find technology that solved those specific problems instead of forcing them to adapt to whatever solution seemed most impressive on paper. I'd implement it in stages, with constant feedback loops, with the understanding that every company is different and cookie-cutter solutions don't work. And I'd measure success not by whether the system had all the features the sales demo promised, but by whether the people using it every day actually felt like it made their lives better. The silence that followed stretched for what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 10 seconds. Marcus was processing what had just happened, running through every moment of the last 20 minutes trying to figure out where he'd lost control of this meeting and how a waitress had somehow become the most important person in the room. Whitmore finished his scotch in one long swallow and set the glass down with a decisive clink. Marcus, he said, turning back to the young CEO with an expression that was completely different from the polite disengagement he'd been wearing earlier. Your pitch was good, your numbers were solid, your technology is clearly cutting edge. But you know what was missing? Everything she just said. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Whitmore held up a hand. I've sat through 37 pitches in the last 6 months from companies that all promised to transform Pinnacle Industries. Every single one of them showed me dashboards and analytics and projected efficiency gains. Not one of them asked me about the 63-year-old foreman who's been running our Chicago plant for 40 years and who's terrified that automation means he's going to lose his job. Not one of them mentioned the workers who've been doing their jobs the same way for decades, and who aren't going to trust some computer system just because management says they should. You want to know why I've rejected every single pitch? Because they were all trying to fix the company without understanding the company. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, something that was equal parts humiliation and realization. He'd spent weeks preparing this pitch, had focused on making it as technically impressive and financially compelling as possible, and he'd missed the entire point. Whitmore turned back to Sarah, who was still standing beside their table, looking like she wasn't sure if she should leave or stay, or possibly just melt into the floor. What's your name? Whitmore asked. Sarah Mitchell, she said. Thank you, Sarah Mitchell, Whitmore said. You just gave me more useful insight in 5 minutes than I've gotten in 6 months of consultant presentations. I'm going to ask you something that's going to sound strange. Would you be interested in consulting on a project? Sarah blinked, certain she'd misheard. I'm sorry, I'm serious, Whitmore said. You clearly understand the human side of business transformation, and that's exactly what I need. I don't need another person to tell me about cloud computing. I need someone who can tell me how to implement it without destroying the culture that's kept my company alive for 93 years. Marcus watched this exchange happening and made a decision that would either save this deal or kill it permanently. Miss Whitmore, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. She's right. Everything she said about my pitch, She's absolutely right. I came here prepared to sell you a solution without ever asking you what problem you actually needed solved. If you're willing to give me another chance, I'd like to start over, not with my pitch, but with questions. Real questions about your company, your people, your culture, and if Sarah's willing, I'd very much like her perspective as we develop an actual implementation strategy. The restaurant noise seemed to fade away, leaving just the three of them in a bubble of possibility that hadn't existed 15 minutes ago. Whitmore studied Marcus with those sharp calculating eyes, looking for something, testing something, then he nodded slowly. Now that, he said, is the first interesting thing you've said all lunch. What happened next was unlike any business meeting Marcus had ever been part of, and he'd been in hundreds. Whitmore pushed his plate aside and started asking questions, real questions about Chen Digital Solutions' implementation process and how flexible it could be. Marcus answered honestly, admitting limitations he would normally have glossed over, acknowledging that his company's standard approach probably wouldn't work for Pinnacle's specific needs. Sarah tried twice to excuse herself and get back to her other tables, but both men insisted she stayed, and her manager, who'd been watching this unusual scene unfold from across the restaurant, made a quick decision that whatever was happening at table 12 was more important than normal service rotation. So Sarah stayed perched on the edge of the booth seat, contributing observations that came from her experience running a small business and from 8 months of watching corporate deals succeed and fail across these tables. She pointed out that Marcus's 5-phase implementation plan didn't include enough time for training or adjustment periods. She mentioned that Whitmore's concern about his older workforce was valid, but probably not as insurmountable as he feared, because people adapted to new technology when they understood why it helped them specifically, not when they were just told it was progress. She asked questions that neither man had thought to ask about communication plans and feedback mechanisms and what happens when the inevitable problems arose during implementation. Marcus found himself taking notes on his tablet, not the polished presentation slides he'd prepared, but actual working notes, ideas and concerns, and new approaches he'd never considered. This was what he'd always imagined business collaboration should feel like. Not formal pitches and defensive responses, but actual problem solving with people who brought different perspectives and experiences to the table. Whitmore ordered another scotch and seemed to shed about 10 years of the weariness he'd been carrying. This was what he'd been looking for in all those rejected pitches, someone who understood that modernizing a 93-year-old manufacturing company wasn't just a technical challenge, it was a human one, a cultural one, and trying to force it through without addressing those elements was guaranteed to fail. By the time the lunch rush had ended and the restaurant was starting to clear out for the afternoon lull, they'd sketched out the framework for something entirely different from what Marcus had pitched. It would be a 2-year implementation process instead of his proposed 18 months, with the first 6 months focused entirely on assessment and planning, on actually understanding how Pinnacle Industries worked before trying to change how Pinnacle Industries work. It would involve extensive interviews with workers at every level from the executive suite to the factory floor, treating them as experts in their own jobs rather than obstacles to progress. It would include pilot programs at individual facilities, with success measured not just by efficiency metrics, but by employee adoption rates and satisfaction surveys. And in a development that surprised everyone, it would include Sarah Mitchell as a paid consultant, someone whose job was to be the voice of skepticism and practicality, to push back when the technology got too far ahead of the people who had to use it. Marcus walked out of the Matteson Grill 3 hours after he'd walked in, and nothing had gone according to plan, but somehow everything had worked out better than he could have imagined. Whitmore had agreed to a preliminary contract, pending a more detailed proposal that would incorporate everything they'd discussed. It wasn't the immediate win Marcus had been hoping for, but it was something more valuable, a genuine partnership with someone who was actually invested in making the implementation succeed. Sarah stood in the restaurant service hallway, her manager cornering her with a mixture of confusion and concern. She'd just spent the better part of her shift sitting at a customer's table instead of working, which violated about 17 different restaurant policies, but those customers had also left a $500 tip on a $200 lunch bill, along with business cards and a handshake agreement that she'd be hearing from both of them within the week. Her manager decided that whatever the hell had just happened, it was above his pay grade to deal with, and he let it go. 3 weeks later, Sarah Mitchell sat in the Chen Digital Solutions office in Palo Alto, reviewing preliminary assessment reports from Pinnacle Industries facilities. She had a consulting contract that paid more than her waitressing job and her failed design agency combined, working 20 hours a week while she figured out what came next. Marcus had asked her to help develop their new implementation framework, the one that prioritized people over systems, that treated company culture as a feature rather than a bug. She'd said yes, partly because the money was good, partly because the work was interesting, but mostly because she'd spent 8 months feeling like her professional expertise and hard-won experience was worthless, and suddenly, here were two powerful men treating her insights like they mattered. Whitmore had called her personally to thank her for what he called the best business advice he'd received in a decade. He'd shared her comments with his board of directors, had started incorporating her people-first philosophy into other modernization discussions beyond just the Chen Digital Solutions project. He'd even mentioned her by name in an industry conference presentation, crediting a waitress at the Madison Grill with helping him understand what his company actually needed. The story had spread through business circles the way unusual stories always did, morphing and changing with each retelling. Some versions had Sarah delivering a passionate speech that convinced Whitmore on the spot. Others claimed she'd actually worked at Pinnacle Industries before and had inside knowledge. The truth was simpler, and somehow more meaningful. She'd just answered a question honestly, had shared her own failure and the lessons she'd learned from it, and it had happened to be exactly what two men needed to hear at exactly the right moment. Marcus's company eventually implemented the Pinnacle Industries transformation over 2 years, exactly as they'd outlined at that lunch meeting. It became a case study in successful digital modernization, featured in business journals and taught at MBA programs. The key innovation, everyone agreed, was the human-centered approach, the insistence on involving workers at every level, on measuring success by adoption and satisfaction rather than just technical metrics. Chen Digital Solutions incorporated this methodology into all their future projects, and their retention rate climbed from 94% to 99%. Sarah never went back to Waitress. She built a new consulting practice focused on helping companies implement change without destroying their culture, working with executives who'd heard about the woman who'd saved a deal with 1 cent. She never forgot that afternoon at the Madison Grill, the moment when speaking up instead of staying quiet had changed the trajectory of multiple companies and her own life. Sometimes the right words at the right moment could reshape everything, could turn a failed pitch into a partnership, could transform a dead-end job into a new beginning. Sometimes all it took was someone willing to tell the truth, even when nobody had asked for it, especially when nobody had asked for it. The sentence that had stunned everyone wasn't complicated or particularly clever, it was just honest, and in a world of polished pitches and carefully managed presentations, honesty had been exactly what was needed.